wokedom has kind of gone, well, I won't say worldwide, but it's certainly gone international. We see it in Germany. We see it, we don't see a lot of it in France, interestingly and happily. We see some of it in other parts of Europe, and we certainly see it in England. And it's interesting to look at it over there and see how it compares to what's going on over here. There clearly are some parallels, although obviously with a kind of British accent. So I want to talk about Glasgow, the city of Glasgow, which a couple of years ago, well, 2019, commissioned what's called the Glasgow Slavery Audit. So they got a bunch of historians, and they said that the wealth of Glasgow seems to have been accumulated through the tobacco trade, which was, of course, tied back in previous centuries, to slave plantations abroad. Not slavery in England, but slavery in the colonies controlled by England. And so Glasgow apparently owes its current status and its importance to this tobacco wealth that was seemingly illicitly generated through slavery. So my thought whenever I hear things like this is, okay, are you planning to give it back? Are you planning to relinquish the wealth that is obviously ill-gotten gains? It's kind of like if you stole a bunch of paintings and they're still hanging up in your house, well, return them to their rightful owners. But Glasgow has no intention of doing this. No surprise. Their idea is to turn this into one of those self-congratulatory virtue-signaling enterprises. How? Because their point is a lot of streets in Glasgow are named after tobacco barons who helped to build the city. And there are also monuments to these same barons sprinkled throughout Glasgow. And their idea is, let's take the monuments down, or let's consider taking them down. Let's consider renaming the streets. And as often happens, this kind of a project kind of gets started, and pretty soon it starts targeting people who shouldn't be targeted. No surprise. We've seen this in America, where they start by saying, well, let's ban the books written by Confederates, and pretty soon you're banning like Huckleberry Finn. You're banning like To Kill a Mockingbird. And in Glasgow, they started out and they identified some people. There's apparently a slave baron named Colin Campbell, John Moore, James Oswald, Robert Peel Jr. And so they started identifying these names of people. Then they started identifying buildings named after people. Hagg's Castle, Lynn House, Glasgow Academy, and then street names, Buchanan Street, Glassford Street. And finally, they settled in on a guy who's one of the most famous missionaries of all time, David Livingstone. Now, you probably know the famous phrase. Livingstone, by the way, was a missionary in Africa, and he sort of went missing. No one could find him. And then an American journalist was sent to look for him, and named Stanley, Henry Stanley. And Stanley found him, and apparently famously said, although said ironically, Dr. Livingstone, I presume. Now, the reason that the irony has been lost in history is that Livingstone was sitting there with basically 200 black Africans. And so obviously he was Livingstone. So the I presume is kind of a little bit of a British joke. But historically, people think, that Stanley really said that. He was kind of identifying Livingstone. Anyway, the point is this: Livingstone is a giant of British history and, in fact, of world history. Here was a guy who not only did missionary conversion in Africa, and by the way, helped to bring Christianity to Africa. Think of it. Today, there are large countries in Africa that are 50% Christian. People like Stanley and Livingstone had a lot to do with that. So Africa is now divided between Christianity and Islam, and the Christian part of it is due to missionary efforts by Livingstone and by others. Now, Livingstone grew up poor, and when he was 10 years old, he worked in a mill. He did this out of desperate poverty. There was nowhere else for him to. He was essentially a child laborer. So this is how idiotic the Glasgow Council is. They're basically saying we need to remove Livingstone's statue in Glasgow because he worked in a tobacco mill that likely used West Indian cotton. Now think about this. First of all, what did Livingstone have to do with that? The cotton barons were having a cotton trade, but here you have this destitute kid who works in a cotton mill because he can't get a job anywhere else. And then he goes on to become a prominent abolitionist. He's against slavery. He has all these statements condemning slavery. He's credited with helping to end the slave trade. And yet he gets caught in the woke net. And there is now talk about taking down his statue. Now, I should say that the Glasgow City Council has not taken any action yet. There have been all these proposals, change the name of this building, change the name of that street, take down Livingstone's statue, but the Glasgow City Council hasn't acted. And kind of what I'm hoping is that cooler heads will prevail, and that as people begin to recognize what's going on here, they'll realize how stupid it is to take down a statue of David Livingstone, a poor kid who came up working in a mill and then went on to become a famous not only missionary, but also abolitionist.